Cool. And you all know me. My name is Mario Garibay. I'm the Assistant Dean of Student Affairs for New York College. And I'll let my colleague and friend introduce himself, Adan Sanchez. But Adan and I were in a doctorate program together that we just wrapped up in 2020, right before everything went to the pandemic. But yeah, so basically I knew Adan from that program. And then also ever since I was a wee little first year student at University of San Diego, he was an older upper class student. And then, he's supervised me twice in my career. And then also had when I was an undergrad, and then was also in my wedding. So I'm glad to have Adan be with us today. And he has a new exciting opportunity that he's working on at San Diego City College. So I'll let him introduce himself and his position there. So Adan.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you, Harper. Hello, everyone. My name is Adan Sanchez. Feel free to use the pronouns he, him, and él. My first language is Spanish, and so I was born across the border in Tijuana, in Mexico. But I've lived most of my life in San Diego. And so as a first-generation college student, English is my second language, from the Mexican Latino background. It's definitely influenced the way that I experience higher education or education in general since I moved to the US. And so, thank you very much for the opportunity. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about what I'm doing and what I'm helping out at San Diego City College. I've been there over a little bit of a year. Before that, I used to work at more traditional four-year colleges and universities in different areas, from residential life, student activities, multicultural affairs, and academic programs, academic advising. So I have a little taste of different programs, and I'm excited to hopefully not just share this information with all of you, but engage with you a little bit more, as I know, everyone is everywhere in terms of their life with Zoom, but hopefully we can have a little more of an engaged conversation today. Thank you.
Yeah. And so today's topic is called Are Students College Ready or College Student Ready? And really it's about shifting the paradigm to meet the needs of our underserved and underrepresented students in higher education. I think a lot of times when you think about, and like the major theme, if there's any takeaway you take today, it's that really the onus is on institutions and colleges to adapt our services and our programs to be able to meet the students where they're at. And so the theme of this quarter for our leadership programs is like, how do we then take the work that we do and then, do good in the world? That's, you've seen some of the workshops, we talk about issues related to equity and different social justice issues. And so this one is framed in a way focused specifically on higher education and what we do here at the university. And so I don't know if any of you eventually will want to move on into higher education, but the idea is that like ultimately, in order to best meet the needs of all the students that you're working with, like it has to be individualized and really intentional when you're working with individual properties, because people come to whatever it is in a different place. So if you end up going into the world of business, how do you adapt and individualize the experience in business? How do you individualize if you get into the medical field, like to be able to really serve all this individual patients, like they come in with different set of circumstances, identities, and backgrounds. And so being able to really take the time and slow things down to be able to meet the needs of individuals within any group or organization you're a part of. And the same is true for all of you who are, entering, you're either part of a student organization or you're entering a student organization. It's really being mindful and intentional with what we're doing with other people, so that when we say that everyone can participate in our organization, when anyone can participate, in the opportunity we're providing, that we genuinely mean that. And I'm going to add the caveat that this takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of time. And part of it is if you're truly invested in making sure that your organization or your space is truly inclusive, it's okay. That's part of, why we do this work and why we try to make the needs of all the people that are part of our groups, because we want to make sure that, it may take time, it may take work, but it's at the end of the day, it's valuable for the members of that organization. So just a little bit of background to compare and contrast kind of like where we're coming from in terms of context. As you're all familiar with the UCSD San Diego context, but specifically my role is that I work with student conduct, student concern, leadership programs, but I'm also responsible for working with first generation transfer international out-of-state students as well, and also work with news orientation. But I'll let Adnan talk more about it, about his experience in the community colleges, because it's a little bit different.
Yeah, thank you, Mario. Yeah, so my lens for today's presentation is through my main role, which is activity director for the Title V. And Title V designation is a federal designation, meaning that we the name that it uses, it's Hispanic Serving Institution. What that means is that we have a percentage of our student population that identifies as Latino, Latina, Latinx. In our case, we use a lot of the terminology around being Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx as well. And I have the opportunity to do work on both the student affairs side, the student services side, and the academic side. So being able to, how do we improve programs in a way that are supporting the whole student, knowing that their way that they show up to school is influenced by their multiple identities, their different roles that they have every day. So we're doing a lot of focus on retention and success of this population. We try to be very equity-minded, for our student services. And then on the academic side, trying to incorporate cultural responsive and cultural responsive kind of course redesign in terms of the pedagogy and the way that faculty are engaging with students. And so one of the ways that you're going to hear a lot from today will be through our intercultural centers. And I'll share a little more about it then. But just in other areas, we're trying to do and grow in the way that we do outreach, academic advising, and therefore a lot of our students, they end up transferring. So how can we support them along the way? And I do want to say that I use intentionally Latino, Latina, Latinx, and also you'll hear Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx to highlight the chronological evolution of the terms. For example, going from Latino to then Latina, and then a little more recent Latinx. And so I use it individually and as a group, but it's really something that I've been doing for a while, especially through my doctoral journey, to really honor the self-identity as a personal choice.
So, sorry. So to kind of go over a little bit of our learning outcomes for today, it's obviously to articulate the paradigm shift from college ready to student ready models. That's really the core. That's really the core of what we're trying to do. The other thing is identifying key practices to create and sustain equity-minded experiences and to recognize areas where institutional changes can be addressed to better support multiple students. And then just, one of the biggest things we want to kind of take away is like, so when you hear of like cultural, or excuse me, being like college ready, what does that mean to you? Like shifting from being like college ready to student ready, what does that mean? And feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat. Can folks hear me? I don't actually.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So what does it mean to be either like college ready or student ready? Like talking about that paradigm shift. And again, feel free to unmute or drop it in the chat. Leslie shares, it means to have the support and the materials necessary to learn and grow. Absolutely. That's the end goal, right, of education. Feeling ready to take on college. And yeah, and I think that really is that perspective of like, our students student ready, right? And I guess like, again, college ready, student has to take prepared in taking rigorous courses. That's part of it. I think, again, that Jennifer, I would say that is that student ready portion of it. We always put the onus on the student that they have to do it, but why? Like, how do we establish the courses so that the students are not having to be prepared? Does that make sense? So it's like, yes, students have to be prepared for these classes, but also on the flip side, how do we make sure that we're meeting the needs of all our diverse, unique students? Because you all have different experiences. So that's, I think, the college ready portion of it, or student ready versus college ready. So thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that. And so another set of terms that we're going to utilize is the difference between equality and equity. So do folks know the difference between, like, share from your perspective what you know in terms of the two terms, equality and equity? Like, what are the differences between the two? So again, feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat. So when you hear the terms equality or equity, what's the difference between the two? Okay. Folks are feeling a little less interactive today, so that's totally fine. In terms of the difference between equality, oh, thank you, Leslie. Assuming everyone benefits from the same support. Yeah, I think the equality also just that I think the same systems of support will be transferable between three different individuals, right? So the image, you've probably seen this on like social media and stuff like that, but equity is truly recognizing that people have different sets of backgrounds or different sets of privileges that make things a little bit more challenging. So when you're thinking about providing the same level of access or level of support to everyone that it does look like it's a little bit different. So there are like opportunities on campus for like tutoring services, for instance, but one set of tutoring services may work differently for one person than another, right? Like if they need additional access or additional support, it's going to look a little bit different because they have less privileges associated to it or whatever. So I think that's the biggest difference between equality and equity. That equality is like, yes, here's the same level of support for everyone, but really people need different forms of support and different levels of support, and that's part of that as well. But taking it one step further, away from like in the terms of equality and equity, but more so justice. And this is what I think the focus of our presentation is that the system is set up in a way that it did privilege certain individuals because of the historical perspective of it. Like when we're thinking about higher education, the traditions of that system is rooted in privilege. And over time, we've been able to provide access to other individuals and provide equity and equality through services that we provide. But at the end of the day, it's like, how do we change the system itself and change the structure so that ultimately folks can approach that system from wherever they come from and still be able to succeed. So going back to that piece of like, I think Leslie shared it earlier about, being able to learn and grow. Like you should be able to come in from wherever your background is and still be able to learn and grow in this system or in this educational setting or in the organization, that anyone can thrive. So whatever it may be, whatever context it is, that we're shifting away from just thinking of equality and inequality, but also to justice and reimagining our general structure, system, or organization, whatever that is that you're in charge of, that you're actually genuinely starting kind of from the beginning and seeing like, how is this privileging certain people over others? Some key concepts that really is infused into a lot of the work that we do. So you might be familiar if you attended the session on imposter syndrome, but basically imposter syndrome is the idea that you don't necessarily belong in a system. So people are already coming to a system, an organization, a setting, a college, whatever it may be, feeling that they're already kind of left out, like they don't necessarily belong there because, again, the system wasn't necessarily set up for them. And so, a lot of times the types of students that we work with, whether they're first generation students, transfer students, a lot of our underrepresented minority populations, women sometimes, really have the sense of imposter syndrome. Like, did I really earn what I did at this time because I belong here, or am I like going to get caught for not being here or for being here when I don't belong here? So this video, again, if you've gone to the session on imposter syndrome, this will look familiar, but I'm going to go ahead and play it for those who haven't seen it.
Even after writing 11 books and winning several prestigious awards, Maya Angelou couldn't escape the nagging doubt that she hadn't really earned her accomplishments. Albert Einstein experienced something similar. He described himself as an involuntary swindler whose work didn't deserve as much attention as it had received. Accomplishments at the level of Angelou's or Einstein's are rare, but their feeling of fraudulence is extremely common. Why can't so many of us shake feelings that we haven't earned our accomplishments, or that our ideas and skills aren't worthy of others' attention? Psychologist Pauline Rose Clance was the first to study this unwarranted sense of insecurity. In her work as a therapist, she noticed many of her undergraduate patients shared a concern. Though they had high grades, they didn't believe they deserved their spots at the university. Some even believed their acceptance had been an admissions error. While Clance knew these fears were unfounded, she could also remember feeling the exact same way in graduate school. She and her patients experienced something that goes by a number of names: imposter phenomenon, imposter experience, and imposter syndrome. Together with colleague Suzanne Imes, Clance first studied imposterism in female college students and faculty. Their work established pervasive feelings of fraudulence in this group. Since that first study, the same thing has been established across gender, race, age, and a huge range of occupations, though it may be more prevalent and disproportionately affect the experiences of underrepresented or disadvantaged groups. To call it a syndrome is to downplay how universal it is. It's not a disease or an abnormality, and it isn't necessarily tied to depression, anxiety, or self-esteem. Where do these feelings of fraudulence come from? People who are highly skilled or accomplished tend to think others are just as skilled. This can spiral into feelings that they don't deserve accolades and opportunities over other people. And as Angelou and Einstein experienced, there's often no threshold of accomplishment that puts these feelings to rest. Feelings of imposterism aren't restricted to highly skilled individuals either. Everyone is susceptible to a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance, where we each doubt ourselves privately, but believe we're alone in thinking that way because no one else voices their doubts. Since it's tough to really know how hard our peers work, how difficult they find certain tasks, or how much they doubt themselves, there's no easy way to dismiss feelings that we're less capable than the people around us. Intense feelings of imposterism can prevent people from sharing their great ideas or applying for jobs and programs where they'd excel. At least so far, the most surefire way to combat imposter syndrome is to talk about it. Many people suffering from imposter syndrome are afraid that if they ask about their performance, their fears will be confirmed. And even when they receive positive feedback, it often fails to ease feelings of fraudulence. But on the other hand, hearing that an advisor or mentor has experienced feelings of imposterism can help relieve those feelings. The same goes for peers. Even simply finding out there's a term for these feelings can be an incredible relief. Once you're aware of the phenomenon, you can combat your own imposter syndrome by collecting and revisiting positive feedback. One scientist who kept blaming herself for problems in her lab started to document the causes every time something went wrong. Eventually, she realized most of the problems came from equipment failure and came to recognize her own competence. We may never be able to banish these feelings entirely, but we can have open conversations about academic or professional challenges. With increasing awareness of how common these experiences are, perhaps we can feel freer to be frank about our feelings and build confidence in some simple truths. You have talent, you are capable, and you belong. Everyone can use a little extra kick of confidence sometimes. Find out.
And so, yeah, I think that essentially kind of is the experience that a lot of our students who they feel like if they don't belong at the university, if they don't belong in the college, that they experience. And I think ultimately, again, the onus isn't on our students. So as Leslie said, being college ready is, that rigor, like, why is this tough for me or anything like that. But really, again, it should shift to being student ready, where it's like, our college and institution set up in a way that people will feel comfortable and will feel supported. So I think that's like the biggest thing that we want to make sure that we're conveying to all of you is that really it's about what can we do as the leaders of whatever organization we're on. Like Alana and myself are, we work at the university. So what can the leaders at the university do to meet the needs of our students? You all as leaders of organizations or of clubs or, whatever group that you're a part of, as leaders, like what are you doing to truly ensure that folks feel like they belong and feel that the organization is there for them, as opposed to the other way around. And because people do have different barriers and already have that sense of like, maybe I don't belong. So one of the things is also shifting from a deficit model to asset-based approach. And it's like, and this goes back to a conversation I think we had early in winter quarter about how do you build a group and organization around the people's strengths that they bring to the table, because everyone at the end of the day has something to contribute to a group, whether, wherever they come from. If we've done like the true colors assessment, different forms of assessment, but everyone has some value or some strengths to the organization. And so you really want to highlight that as well. And like people bring in different forms of what we call capital. So, or just like different strengths and, and that they can bring to an organization. So I think it's really important to focus on that as well. So that, again, that combats that imposter syndrome if people don't feel like they belong. So just really briefly about UC San Diego. And again, this is all information you're familiar with. So I'll briefly go over it so that Adan can talk more about the stuff that he does at the community colleges. But at 2019, 2020 new student enrollment data shows that there's 65.5% first-year students and 34.5 transfer students. Again, this isn't a small population of students at the university. Like this is at least a third of our university. And, oftentimes you hear from transfer students is that they're like, well, people sometimes forget about us, or we feel rushed, or we feel like an afterthought. And so, if they're a third of your population is feeling and experiencing this, and it's like, how do we prioritize their experiences? And so just some stuff to like keep in mind about transfer students is there's diversity within the transfer student population itself. So they have different experiences. Either they've gone from when you're at a university, they did 2 years at a community college and transferred over. They may differ in age, regional background, basically that there is a lot of diversity. And so when you talk about a set of population of students, it's also keeping in mind like everyone has unique experiences. And so here's some of the stuff that we gleaned from a survey that we did in fall 2017, both in a focus group as well as a survey results that was conducted by the Assistant Dean group. But again, here are the experiences, here are the barriers that students are experiencing. This is why they're not connecting and engaging with our college or our university rather, so that, what is their need, like having a sense of belonging, needing a space that's specific for them, looking at the intersection with other identities, feeling behind and feeling like an afterthought. So what are we doing as an organization? What are we doing as an institution to be able to ensure that these things that are shortfalls or barriers that of the institution to really make sure that we're engaged with our transfer students? So at UC San Diego, some of the opportunities of how we're trying to address this is that there's a central transfer center that was just started a year ago. Again, this is like all relatively new, and this is why we need to shift the focus to how to meet the needs of our students. And there's also decentralized transfer support within the colleges. There's also programs and services through a transfer student lens. So like as a transfer student, how am I experiencing this service? How am I experiencing this program? And how can I, as an institution, make sure that they're experiencing it in a positive way so that it is set up for their success? Looking at study abroad involvement opportunities so that they're able to do that in their 2, 3, 4 years at the institution. And then also like looking at our orientation programs, like the experience of our transfer students is going to look different. So that's why there is a transfer specific orientation program, because we have to acknowledge and own the fact that people come in and from different places. Similar for our first generation students. So this is just a quick definition of first generation college students. Here at Mirror, we sort of have a broader definition of just like anybody who has a similar experience to those of first generation students, in the sense that, people have, again, there's a lot of diversity. So like, for instance, for myself, like my mom, after I went to, when I was like in middle school and like elementary, middle school, went back to school. So technically I'm not a first generation student because my mom did that, but my experiences are really similar because I don't know a lot of the same information or don't have the same level of social capital that that other folks do. But so it's just, some of the, I really connect and engage with kind of the themes of a first generation college student. So that's why I gravitate towards that identity. But the other thing is that at UC San Diego, 38% of the undergraduate student population identifies as first gen. Again, same with the transfer student population. This is a huge population, but still a lot of times you hear similar things about our first generation students not engaging or feeling like they're lost and they're confused on campus. And so one thing that we try to address that, and what we really strive to do is, again, it puts it on the institution, like how are students navigating our policies and processes, and how can we adapt our policies and processes in a way that invites our students to them in a way that, you know, they don't necessarily have to adapt. Again, going back to what Leslie shared. So again, thank you for sharing that, Leslie, because it's like, again, the onus is on the student, right? If you're being college ready, it's like, how are we helping them navigate our policies and process? But instead, it's like, how do we change our policies and process so they don't have to like adapt to it? Same thing for like using a first generation lens in our work, and then celebrating, again, recognizing people's accomplishments, and then engaging folks where they are. And one of the biggest things that we learned is the cohort model. So like, if you've participated in first gen events at Muir College, they tend to be a little bit smaller and tight knit, where people are able to build community. And going back to that video about first generation students, it's about, okay, so you're also going through a similar experience. How can we connect with each other so that we're working through this together? And something unique about first generation students is also familial expectations. And oftentimes you hear this, but when you enroll a first generation student, you actually enroll the whole family, because their family is learning along the way as well. So just being able to help educate not just the student, but also provide education to the families as well. So that includes providing them information for expectations around weekends and breaks. And I know that's really weird right now because most of y'all are at home, but you know, what does that boundary look like between, you know, your own personal experience at, you know, at the university, between like what your expectations are for family? FERPA, like explain what those boundaries are. Also just explain that, oh, there's a lot of terminology and a lot of stuff that, you know, our families just don't know about. Like if, you know, if you asked my mom what some of the stuff was, like she was kind of learning along the way. And so, yeah, so just acknowledging that. And then lastly, that family is a source of support. So oftentimes it's that other side of things. Like it's always seen as kind of like a barrier, but sometimes like if you ally with our families, then like, I think it's helpful. Same. So at UC San Diego, there's several cohort-based groups, and it's okay to have multiple groups because, again, folks will connect where they feel most comfortable. So it's important to have both a centralized and decentralized system at the same time. And then again, celebration, social community building, workshops on, you know, on getting involved in interviewing from a first generation lens. Like first generation students are going to experience getting involved in a different way. You know, they have a different set of expectations. They also don't know the same amount, like, you know, they don't know the same thing around like getting involved that other people do, or interviewing. Like, you know, if you do have imposter syndrome, how do you address and, you know, overcome that imposter syndrome for interviewing? And so again, how do we adapt our systems? How do we adapt our programs to meet the needs of our first generation students? And last but not least, I want to kind of touch briefly upon URM, and then I will transition over to Adan. But here are the demographics for UC San Diego from 2019-20, or excuse me, 2019 to 2020. And one of the biggest things is understanding that people will come from different places and need to be with one another. So here's a quote from a book called Why Are the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And it focuses on affinity groups. And that it's students who represent, or students who identify as underrepresented minorities will gravitate towards affinity groups because, again, that's a source of support for them. So having a place to be rejuvenated and to feel anchored in one's cultural community increases the possibility that one will have the energy to achieve academically as well as participate in the cross-group dialogue interaction many colleges want to encourage. So that's why there's like the cultural centers on campus. That's why we do affinity groups within Muir College, to be able to provide the space that people can come in and engage with other people that are like them, and that's okay. And then they can engage with the institution as a whole. So again, what opportunities are we providing as an institution to be able to support people's own personal and cultural development as well? So as I mentioned, there's the affinity spaces, the prevention and response to bias and hate incidents, reviewing policies, again, with the lens of all our students and each of our students, and being very intentional that we're making sure that, again, the policies and practices that we have are adapting to our student needs and not the other way around. And increased representation and emphasis on retention. And then last but not least, I added the ASU demands because that is a direct way in which we're, as an institution, are being called upon to say, like, here are areas that we're not connecting with the campus, and that the campus can do better and should do better. And so that's something that's always at the top of our minds, is like, how are we doing better? How are we serving better? And then last but not least, like, how do we do this in a virtual setting? And again, that we're providing more smaller events and affinity spaces, also recognizing that your experiences are a little bit different now, because some of you may be at home, and then kind of going back to that whole familial expectations, like what that looks like, and it's a little bit different. But really being able to encourage online engagement and representation, and being intrusive, like making sure that we are there and we're there for you and reminding you about that, because we don't want you to feel lost in all this. And then also that there's asynchronous options, which is why we record sessions like this, because you all have additional commitments. You're not just students. You also work, you also do other things. And so I think that's important to be mindful of. And so we're going to transition over to Adhan. Adhan, you're still with us?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you all. And so we're going to transition over to Adhan and to talk about a little bit of what he's been working on.
Thank you, Mario. My internet's been a little bit rough this morning, so if at some point my sound starts freezing, just let me know. I'll turn off my camera and see if that helps. But I'll keep my camera on as much as possible today. So thank you, Mario. And I think a lot of that is also happening at the community college level, and I hope that a lot of the work or things that I said today, you are able to also contextualize it at UCSD and being able to figure out how that works, okay? All right, I got my first message of internet unstable, so let me know. So going back to the initial question, of our students college ready or our college is student ready, I think we expect, I think all of you did an amazing job in kind of figure out what is the difference between the two. And I think, when we say the students college ready, it's really this expectation that we have that students have to fit the structures that we have in place. The services, the programs, the guidelines, the policies that we have, in higher education. Are the students able to because higher education institutions is, whether we want to recognize it or not as a whole, it also contributes to the systems of oppression that we have as a society, because higher education was not created primarily for people of color, right? And so we have these marginalized populations which continue to be underrepresented and underserved in higher education. And Mario was able to highlight a little bit of those pieces and the percentages that are currently taking place at UCSD. So how can we shift this mindset from going to our students college ready to our institutions of higher education, are they student ready? So one of the ways that I say is like we get to know our students. Who are they, right? As you can see in this image, we have students who are influenced every day by their race and ethnicity, their gender and their gender identity, even their gender expression, right? Socioeconomic status, learning and physical abilities, your religion, if any. Are you a first generation college student? Based on what Mario just shared, is English your second language, like myself? And we had to learn, all this, a whole way of, presenting and talking to others, engaging with others. We also have students who are veterans, who are former foster youth, formerly incarcerated, right? We have students who are, they have dependents, or maybe they take care of a parent or a legal guardian, right? They also have that role of taking care of someone else. I think our student citizenship status is also influencing the way that they engage with others and access to things. Students who are undocumented, or they're part of a mixed family status, where they are born in the US, or they have the documentation to be in the US, but they have some of their family members who are undocumented. And that makes a difference too in the way that you experience college, because that there's that a little bit of anxiety or unknown of, is my family going to be okay? Also students, do they have full-time jobs while they're going to school full-time? or do they have a part-time job, or sometimes even multiple part-time jobs, maybe one on campus and one off campus? I know that's been a little bit tricky, especially in the last year through the pandemic, but these are realities that influence the way that our students are making decisions, even to attend class and the time that they spend studying and working on their projects, right? So we have to be aware of these identities, how they intersect, and how they influence in the way that students show up to our schools. Okay, and so we have to be aware of those in the way that we engage with them. And there's really no easy formula in the way that we do this, and that's why it's important for each one of us to look at how I individually, am I aware of my own identities, my own privileges, and the way that I interact with others, and how can I create the space around me with, the way that I talk to them, the way I engage with them, and even the programming and the services that we offer as student leaders. How can we do a better job in doing this work? Okay, Mario, next slide, if you don't mind. So, I also have this quote for you all that I want to read because it also, helps me a little bit more in the way that I contextualize it a little more about what I mean with multiple identities. So this quote says, "What does this school reality mean for a Latinx girl who is queer, undocumented, and disabled? How do Black girls who are a combination of these identities deal with the complexities and the realities of discrimination, harassment, and violence? In this way, intersectionality not only provides a way in which to think about the communities we belong to, but also a means to discuss all of our communities in ways that are inclusive of how oppression intersects our everyday lives inside of the classroom." Okay. So in this quote, what I like about it is that it doesn't just talk about a sense of belonging. I think when we talk about higher education and welcoming events and student leader events, we always talk about a sense of belonging and creating a welcoming environment for our students, right? But this quote also, how about what it says there, how oppression intersects our everyday lives, right? And like I said, with this knowledge that we know that there are systems of oppression across the US, it's not about creating just spaces for students to feel like they belong, but also creating spaces for us to recognize that their daily lives are also influenced and impacted by the negative components of systemic oppression. And so what can we do proactively to address those barriers in these students' lives? Okay, so again, one of the examples that I usually give for folks who work in higher education is that we tend to have trainings about how to better support our lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer plus communities, right? So we have, some sort of allied training, and we have, what we call undocu allied trainings. There are military allied trainings, and we offer these trainings for a lot of students, faculty, and staff, but sometimes we only ask for volunteers at these trainings. If we're really trying to create change and we're trying to create a space for students to feel like they belong and we care for them, how can we institutionalize some efforts that are creating a culture where everyone wants to be part of these trainings so that they can better understand how the students work and function, and how can we better support them, right? And the list goes on in terms of examples like that. For example, we want to support our undocumented students, but we don't have a structure to give them work on campus, right? So what can we do as a college to create programs and services that are, again, understands the limitations of some of our student populations and find ways to proactively support them by creating program services within our college to support them in their needs, right? Another example that I always talk about is childcare. A lot of students who are parents, they need that childcare support. Is there something on campus where there's a childcare facility, or how can different programs and departments across campus create child-friendly spaces so that students can bring their kids and they don't have to feel like their kids are an obstruction to the work that's happening in the office, right? So these are things that, again, if you're hosting a program, are you mindful of students who are parents and in the way that you are having some resources for them? Okay. Next slide, Mary. So at San Diego City College, just to give you a little bit of example of what we're doing, is we're building dedicated spaces to support these umbrella student populations, and we really emphasize the intersection of our identities, so that we can really validate, the multiple identities and roles that we hold, going back to my earlier slide, right? Since we know that these identities and roles have different expectations, have different ways that they influence our daily lives, we need to be able a little bit more mindful about how we support them. So at San Diego City College, we are creating, and some of them are still virtually because they were created during the pandemic, are these centers that we're creating for undocumented students, for first generation students, for formerly incarcerated students, specific for women or students who identify as women, and our LGBTQ plus community, right? And so these are kind of all the umbrella student populations that we're looking at. Then also, how do we create programs that highlight their intersectionality in the way that feel validated and supported? So if you go to the next slide, Mario. So these are some of the ways that we're trying to highlight, again, that intersectionality. So for example, on the top left, we had an event, that focused on this book that kind of talked about being Latino and then also being part of the queer community. So we have a faculty member who was part of this book as an author, and he was able to talk about growing up Latino and being identified under as queer, gay. And so he talked about the challenges that he faced, and he talked about the opportunities that also he had. I think on the bottom left, we also had different events with podcasts, because we needed those for free events, free resources for students. And so we talked about, being it's on this series that you can find on YouTube. It's Undocumented Tales, and it's about this individual who identifies as Latino and undocumented, and he's also gay. And so, we highlighted the podcast, and we talked about it. Identities influence the way that he interacts with others, the way that he builds relationships, the way that he builds relationships with his own family, and career options, right? And so we had a really good dialogue about all of those components. In the middle, you see that we wanted to also focus on women in STEM. And women in general are a small percentage of those in the STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So we really wanted to highlight a series of events where we invite different women, primarily women of color, to talk about their lives, to talk about their experiences, to talk about how they were able to do it, so that we can encourage students to also not just see themselves through their eyes on her, but being able to understand a little bit more of what are some of the steps that they need to do to also stay and succeed in these fields. I think on the bottom right a little bit, you see a flyer that says Ni de aquí, ni de allá. And it was really an event to kind of focus and highlight more so that, again, the Latino population is not one size fits all, right? That there's a very diverse group of students underneath that umbrella. And we have students who are undocumented, and we have students who are transborder, meaning that they can cross the border, and many of them do, to come to school or to work. But in the eyes of many, Latino students are experiencing the same thing. But these two student populations are very different. The transborder students can come in and out of the country with no problem. They can travel anytime they want, right? Where our undocumented students, they have very limited opportunities to travel, even within our own county. and the way that they have access to things, federal grants, federal scholarships, even internships. There could be limitations on some types of internships that they can. We just hosted, some panelists from NASA promoting their internship, and unfortunately they said, if you're not a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, you cannot qualify for internships. So we have to find that distinction and find other ways to give our undocumented students other ways for them to get hands-on experience for a major that they want to pursue. And then the last one is, we talked about the X and Latinx. We use that term relatively now more. And so we kind of talked a little bit about what that means and the evolution of the terms. And then what does it mean again to have this term that represents, being Latino and being part of the LGBTQ+ population. So again, we've been trying to have these dialogue-based programs because it really helps us to connect and re-engage with students, because I've been saying it for a while now that, now with the pandemic, I feel like our students need us more, but in some way, we're less accessible because they can't just show up to our offices, they can't walk into our centers, and it has to be a little more coordinated, in a way to engage with each other, okay? So again, I just wanted to share a little bit of these examples for all of you, and see if maybe that will spark some questions or some thoughts, some comments, some reflections, even on your own experiences as how you're experiencing college and your roles at UCSD. But for my part, that's pretty much it.
Cool. Thank you, Alan, again for sharing information and joining us today. We do want to open it up to folks if you do have any questions. Yeah, we can ask that now. Again, feel free to drop in the chat, or you could feel free to unmute if you have any questions. And it can either be for myself or Alan, or both.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be great to hear just maybe something that resonated with you. Feel free to add it to the chat. Any comment, anything